Hey everybody, welcome back to Jim's Garage. In this video, we're going to be setting up our own mesh VPN network using Netbird. Now, in a previous video, I showed you how to use Headscale, and that was a prelude to me setting up my own private virtual cloud. This, I thought, is the opportune moment to go and test Netbird, because I know a load of you guys have been asking for this. I'm really pleased to say that I'm probably going to be switching from Headscale to Netbird, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll see why. From everything I've seen so far and the limited use I've had over the past week, much better UI, easier to use, a little bit more complicated perhaps to set up, but I'm going to solve that for you today. Everything just seems to be a lot more polished. Now, obviously there's tail scale and you can go and use that and there's no problem with that. I'm just comparing that to something like head scale, which does work, but again, doesn't have that same level of polish. Anyway, if you want to hear more about the theory of what a mesh VPN is, go and check out my previous videos. I won't cover that in this topic. That's because we've got enough configuration to get through. So let's now hop into the configuration. I'll take you through a review of the documentation on the Netbird website because there's a few ways that you can set this up. I'm going to show you how to set this up using an existing Traefik proxy, which if you follow my videos you already have, and you likely already have anyway, be it Traefik, Nginx or whatever. It's also going to use as an identity provider Authentik, albeit you can use something like Citadel or Keycloak. Again, I have videos on those, but the key thing there is it's going to be using an existing identity provider. You can also use external identity providers, but I'm not going to do that in this video. We want to keep this all self-hosted. On top of that, it's obviously going to be running in Docker, and there's a few configuration files we need to tweak before we get this up and running. So let's hop straight into it. So if we head over onto their website, you'll see that it's configured very similarly to Tailscale. There are enterprise offerings for this where you can sign up to their website and you can use the existing service that they provide for you. What we're interested in though is doing the self-hosted approach. So if we go onto the install, sorry, the zoom function doesn't work on this page for some reason, but here you can see how you can basically download the clients and get this up and running. By default, this is going to be using the enterprise version or the Netbird hosted version, so similar to how most people will be consuming Tailscale, even the free version, but we don't want to do that. We actually want to set this up ourselves. But do bear in mind, this is how we'll be setting up and downloading clients later once we have our own server set up. So what we need to do is click onto the installation guide. Now, once we're in the installation guide, there's quite a few things that we can do. Now, as I alluded to at the beginning of the video, there are actually a number of ways to set this up. So there is the quick start guide. So if we click on here, there's a handy video. And actually the quick start guide is as quick as either using the enterprise version, which you just need to go through their website, download the clients. And then if we look down the left-hand side, you'll see the self-hosted. Again, there's a quick start guide. So this quick start guide will basically download everything you need. So you can run this script here. Say you have a virtual machine or a bare metal box. You can run this script and within a few minutes, it will basically pull down Docker. It will then deploy an identity provider. I think by default it's Citadel, which I've covered before. And then it will set up the Docker containers necessary to run Netbird on your machine, and it will sort out all of the certificates for you, the reverse proxy and all of that, which is great if you just want to get this up and running quickly, but obviously not great if you have an existing setup like I assume you have. For that instance, we're going to need to go to the advanced guide. Now, this is where it got a little bit tricky and it took me a little bit of time to figure all of this out. That's because, again, in the advanced guide, there's basically two options. There's the one that uses setting this up just on your own infrastructure, and then if you actually see on the bottom right here, you see there's advanced running Netbird behind an existing reverse proxy, and there's additional configurations for not using Citadel. So in this instance, I'm going to be using Authentik. The only reason I do that is because typically for a home lab environment, I find Authentik ticks all of the boxes. Don't get me wrong, Keycloak, Citadel, both great products, but for a lot of home applications that still don't support OAuth 2, etc., you need to fall back to that proxy. And neither of those offerings have the proxy, whereas Authentik does. So let's have a quick look now through the advanced guide for setting this up. I'm going to whistle through this so that I can get onto the actual technical configuration. So for the advanced guide, really, you basically need to ensure that you've got a virtual machine with Docker already installed, and you need to have a public IP address, and you need to make sure that these ports are going to be forwarded. You can also forward these ports here for stun and turn protocols, and then we're basically onto the deployment. So you can run this script if you wanted to, but like I say, we want to use an existing setup. So the first thing that we need to do is basically grab a copy of the setup.environment file. So much like in other videos I've got, we need to set up and configure an environment variable first, all the files in there, etc., all the settings configs. We then need to create the Docker Compose file from that file, and then we need to set up Authentik and then get into that. So if you look here, you'll see that basically we need to clone this repository. So if you run this here, you'll download the latest repo. Now, if I go into my VS Code, I'll show you what that looks like. So over here on VS Code, this is on my Docker virtual machine. Don't worry, I'll be going back to the documentation in a minute. This is basically what it looks like. So it's going to download, so you want to navigate to wherever you're storing this. I put it in my docker/netbird/netbird file. That's where it's downloaded all of those GitHub files. Now, when it does that, it basically downloads this setup.example file here. So this is an example copy. And what you need to do is create a copy of that, call it setup.env, and you're going to put all of your actual variables in this one. Once you've done that, there's a handy configure.shell script, and what that does is you run this script, it takes the environment variables in this file, and then it spits out a Docker Compose file. In this instance, I used the Traefik example file because I'm obviously using Traefik. That actually didn't work by default just because of the way I've got some of my labels set up, so I did have to amend that before it worked. But I'm not going to go into too much detail in that because I've actually got the configuration files for you. But if we head back to the documentation, you'll see that once we've set up the environment variables as discussed here, and remember, because we're using a different identity provider, there are additional instructions for that. So I followed the Authentik instructions, and we'll have a look at Authentik in a moment to get that set up. But once you've done that, you can input all of these variables in here, and then you can run the configuration script. Let's have a quick look at the Authentik, just so we know what that looks like. So for Authentik, and if you've watched my previous videos, you've seen me do this for a few applications, things like Portainer, etc. So you basically need to create an application and provider. So you set that up exactly as it says in here. I'm not going to walk you through that process because it is literally just a case of clicking buttons and following exactly what's on here. So the key thing really is to change this domain to whatever your domain is. So for example here, jimsgarage.co.uk, again the same here, and then just leave this local host for those local connections. You need to make sure that that self-signed certificate's there and follow through all of those extra parameters. Then you need to get on to creating the external application. So that's all done here. And then you need to create a service account, and that's what it's going to use to connect when it does the authentication. So hopefully once you've got that ready, it will look something like this. And if I now log into my Authentik, I'll show you what that looks like. Here's the provider that you need to set up. So this Netbird one, and if you click edit, you'll see all of those variables are put in. There's those redirects, etc. You'll see the client ID, all of that good stuff, and that's set up exactly as it says on that website. And then if you go to the applications, you'll see the corresponding app for that. Here's Netbird, and if I click edit, you'll see those parameters again, exactly as the documentation specified. And I think in system, and no, it's not in system, I think in directory users, you'll see that I've created the Netbird user for that service account as well, which is what's required. So not going to go into clicking buttons for you on that one, just follow the guide exactly as specified. I didn't have any issues with this part of the video. So now back over onto the instructions, you'll see that you can now specify these parts, and you'll get this exactly from the Authentik website. So when you log in, you'll get all of these endpoints, and you need to copy this over now into your setup.env. So now we've done that, we're ready to go on to the rest of the instructions for the deployment. Step 4 is optional. I didn't bother doing that and left it as is. As I mentioned, step 5, I ran that configuration.shell, and that created the Docker Compose file for me using those environment variables. So once you've done that, you should be able to just run the Docker Compose up. Like I say, that didn't work for me. I'm going to have a look now at the actual variables, and we'll go into detail of what this is actually doing. So hopefully you should just need to copy and amend what I have for you, but understand that this is how I created those files. So over on my Docker machine now, The only two files you need, you can ignore all of these. These are just the assets that are used from creating and running that configuration.shell. Just follow those instructions. But effectively, all you need is the setup.environment variables. So let's have a look at this. And the Docker Compose file, which is this one here. So the key things really that you need to specify here is the domain. That's because this is where it's going to be hosting and listening for. I've set the external IP to be the external IP of my Docker VM. This also does work in Kubernetes, and there's a Helm chart for that, and I'll possibly cover that in a future video. Next, we get things like the OIDC configuration endpoint. This is just taken from when you do the Authentik setup, so you'll get this from your identity provider, so don't worry about what the heck is this. That will do it for you. You just copy and paste it in here. This again is just the client IDs, and you'll get that from Authentik, and it tells you exactly where to put these variables as I showed on the previous page. That's all this stuff here, so you'll see that Netbird auth configuration endpoint. That one is this one here, so you just need to copy and paste those values in. Once that's done, there isn't really much else you need to do in here. All I did was literally follow those instructions, and then I got on to generating the Docker Compose file. The key thing here really is to Netbird disable Let's Encrypt True. That's because we don't want Netbird to be pulling down certificates for our server. We're letting Traefik do that for us, and we've already got that set up. So now if we head over to the actual Docker Compose file, like I said, it created a Docker Compose file, but it wasn't quite right for the labels that I needed for my setup. So this is a multi-container setup. So we have the dashboard, we then have Signal, we then have management, and we also have the Coturn server. The Coturn server doesn't run behind the proxy. So just looking through the dashboard, we've obviously commented out the ports because we're going to be using the reverse proxy to expose this. We've set the management API endpoint to be this here, and this is generated automatically because we put it in the setup environment variable. We put this as at the top, we put this as our Netbird domain, and that's where it copied it over for me. And all of the endpoints are going to be the same. The auth audience is that client ID. We don't need the secret in this instance because we're using the server's account, which we'll reference later. The auth authority is obviously my Authentik, so that's what I'm using as my identity provider. The scopes, it can use any of these as advertised when it goes and does the query. So actually when you do this configuration script, it actually queries Authentik. And if I go to the API on Authentik, it would show you all of the supported scopes. The rest we can leave blank for the redirect and silent because that's taken care of within Authentik itself. And the source is actually an access token as defined in the documentation. Nginx is running on 443 inside the containers, and we don't need the Let's Encrypt. I could probably just delete that, but I've left it as is because that's what's in the documentation. But like I say, Let's Encrypt is already taken care of with Traefik. We've created a volume to store Let's Encrypt, but like I say, that probably isn't needed. I might tidy that up in the future. And crucially, I've put it on the proxy network. So this is the network my existing Traefik instance is on. And then I've added some Traefik labels. So nothing really new here. It's sitting on port 80, which is quite standard when we've got this behind a reverse proxy. And that's all we need to get the dashboard up and running. Next up is the Signal container. Now that's required to have a volume, and that's where it's going to mount it to. Because we're running this behind the proxy, we can get rid of all of the ports commands because we can see here in the Traefik label, we mount it on port 80. And we use the scheme of H2C. We've used that before for different containers, and that's basically the H2 protocol. One thing that's important on this is actually the path prefixes. Now, I didn't create these were generated by the script, but those need to be in there to make sure that this functions correctly, so it gets all of those redirects correct. Next, we're on to the management interface. There's a few volumes here. Again, that Let's Encrypt probably isn't required. And the ports are commented out because it's going to run again behind the reverse proxy. So here we can see that it's running a command to set itself up and configure itself on 443. And it's also running behind my domain. In the proxy labels, it's actually setting up two entry points. So it's got the Netbird API and then the Netbird management. Both of those are going to be running on HTTP, HTTPS. and they both run on port 443, again with that server scheme of H2C that's required for the management interface. Again, there's a couple of path prefixes on both of those, so you don't have to put the trailing slashes in, and both sit on the proxy network, so nothing too exotic there. Lastly, we have Coturn, and that's on our domain name of netbird.gymsgarage, and we've got a volume there for the configuration file and read-only mode, and that's set on the host, and it runs the command to basically use that configuration file. That's pretty much it. At the bottom, we've obviously got the volumes that we're using, and we've got the network and its external true because we created this proxy network earlier in my Traefik videos. Okay, so with that run through now complete, and like I say, to generate this, do just follow the instructions on the website and make sure you've got your identity provider set up. You don't have to use Authentik, you can use Citadel Keycloak, and there are different instructions for that, but broadly speaking, it's an identical process. So we're now ready to hop into the terminal. So in the terminal, I'm going to navigate now to where I have these files residing. So that's in my Docker Compose, Netbird infrastructure artifacts. So a bit of an unusual file structure because this is just what it created when I ran the script. You could obviously tidy this up once the files are generated to whatever you want. You probably do need the configuration.json file, which is this one here for OpenID. So all of this is created when you run the script as well. It actually goes off and queries your Authentik or whatever identity provider you are using and pulls down all of the supported formats, protocols, etc., all of the supported parameters, claims. Similarly for the management JSON as well, it puts in here and generates some certificates and passwords, etc., for connecting to internal services. So you will need to have these in your folder. But without going through all this, just because this is auto-generated, you don't need to do this yourself. We're ready to get into the deployment. So now navigating to this folder, and you can see all of these files are in there. It should just be a case of running your sudo docker compose up-d, and when we do that, it should go away now and pull down all of the containers. Once that's done, we'll have a quick look and see if that's up and running, but it should just pull pretty quickly. These aren't big files. Remember, once you pulled this down, you need to make sure that you go away and create your domains in your internal domain service, so netbird.gymsgarage, add it to your hosts, your firewall, your Pi-hole, your AdGuard, whatever it is you use, and then you should be able to navigate to this in your web browser. You can see here that this container is running, and if we hop over into Portainer, we can see here that we've got the Coturn server, the dashboard, the management, and the signal. And here's my Authentik that's already running in the background as demonstrated. So now if we head to netbird.gymsgarage.co.uk, fingers crossed, everything is up and running. So if I hit return, you can see, yep, it's logged straight in, and it also did the Authentik piece as well. And now we're ready to get started. Let me just show you what happens the first time you do this, because I've got some saved credentials and I'm already logged into Authentik. So in an incognito browser, if I go to Netbird, so this time, because I'm incognito, I'm not actually logged into Authentik. So it's going to say, hey, welcome to Authentik. So I'm going to put my email address in here. I'm going to click login. Now it's going to ask me for my password. Hit continue. And now it should successfully, as you saw in the top, redirect me. So again, now I'm back. I've authenticated with Authentik, and because it's the trusted identity provider, it's taken the identity of my admin user in Authentik, and it's then created that user, and it uses that now for Netbird. So you can obviously go and create as many users as you want in Authentik, and you can then pass those credentials out to different people so they can log in via Authentik into your Netbird application, which is super cool. So now we're ready to get on to the actual configuration. Unfortunately, again, I can't zoom because this is kind of a pop-up. But like I showed earlier in the video, it's really simple to get this up and running. So you can see that there's Linux, Windows, Mac OS, iOS, Android, and even Docker containers for this. So this is for the client. And it's really straightforward and very similar to how you set up the official one using the official Netbird infrastructure. So effectively, similar to the head scale, you download the binary or whatever it is, and you simply choose to connect to an alternate server. In this case, you'll connect to netbird.yourfqdn, and then you'll go through that authentication process with Authentik. So let me now demonstrate that using Linux, which people will probably be using, and I'll also demonstrate that on a Windows VM and a Android phone. So here I've created a virtual machine, conveniently named Netbird-demo, and we're simply going to follow the instructions behind us. So to install with the command line, we can just run this script here. This is just a convenient script. You can obviously install it using a package manager if you want, following these instructions here. So over in the VM, let's get this installed. That's all up and running. Now all we need to run is netbird up and provide it with a -- management URL and then put in the URL for our server. Now that's not quite true, because when you run this, what you'll find is it will spin up and then it will say head to this URL here. Now that URL doesn't work for me. When I go there, it just sort of times out. So what I actually found I needed to do was go back into your Netbird, close this down. I can make that a little bit larger now. And what we need to do is go to some setup keys. So a bit like in Headscale, where we can create those pre-authorization keys, it's exactly the same thing. So let's create a setup key, and I'm just going to call this one Ubuntu. You can choose obviously any of the options you want here. I'm just going to keep them as the defaults. You could choose to reduce the validity of the expiration date on those if you wanted, etc. Create that setup key, and now I'm going to copy that to the clipboard. Now what I can do with that is go back into here. We'll Control C, so to not set that up. I'll press up again just to get that command, and then I can do -- setup and then -key, and then I can paste that key in. Now in the background, I'm not going to press return yet. Let's close that and let's go to peers. Peers is empty. We haven't actually set one up, but hopefully it will dynamically update when I hit return here. So now that says it's connected, and then hopefully in the background, yeah, bingo, there we go. We've got the Netbird demo machine that's just been added. Perfect. You've just added your first node or peer to your Netbird network. So now that we've got one in there, that's great. Let's get another one in. I'm going to show you now on my phone how to download and install Netbird onto your Android device. So once you've installed the Netbird application from your marketplace, you can see that when you open it, it says by default it's going to connect to Netbird's cloud servers. That's what we discussed earlier. That's the similar sort of behavior you get for Tailscale. But what we actually need to do is click the orange there for change server. Now, when we change server, we obviously want to put in our own server, that netbird.yourfqdn.com. So now with the right server in place, hopefully we can click change. It's now verified. Server was changed. We've got the green tick instantly. Okay, great. But we can't actually connect it yet because we need to go through the Authentik authorization piece. So if we now click on the gray icon in the middle, it's going to ask the default Android permissions. Do you want to allow this as a VPN connection? We're going to say okay. It's now connecting, and you'll see it's going to push me through Authentik. So again, I'm going to put in my username and password for Authentik. Once I've done that, it's then going to go through exactly the same process as we saw before. So now you can see that I'm connected. And that's basically all you need to do. You can also scroll up from the bottom, and you can see that I've got that Netbird demo Jim's Garage. That's actually my Linux box. So already they're by default on the same network and can connect to one another. We can obviously change that later on, and we can put some granular access in place to revoke or restrict whatever we want to have access. And you still get the exact same control over which one you want to function as an exit node. So that's basically it to set it up on Android. As simple as that, and I expect it's very similar on iOS. Let's hop now back over and let's just double check what's going on in the Netbird UI. So now back over in Netbird, let's just click off that, and then let's click back on the peers. You can see that my mobile's there. I've actually disconnected it. Let me just click connect. My phone now says connected. Hopefully that'll go green any second. Let me just refresh. Yeah, there we go. Oh, there's a refresh button there as well. So yeah, basically now you can see that I've got both of those machines connected to my Netbird network, And now what you can actually do if you wanted to, for example, you could go into your access control and you could go to your policies and you could actually do things like, there's a default rule there, a bit like a firewall rule. If you click that, now on my Android, I can't actually see that Linux box. It basically breaks all connections. You could then put in specific rules and change the order of them, etc. Or you can just put it on and everything can see everything. Thankfully, the instructions for Windows is simple. So if we add a peer again and we want Windows, we simply need to download Netbird and then go to this URL here. So if I hop into my Windows VM, in here, let's go to netbird.jimsgarage again. It's going to ask us to authenticate, so I'm going to put my username and password in. Obviously, you could do this with a pre-auth key as well if you didn't want to go down this route, but it's entirely up to you. This is obviously logging me now into Netbird. And now that we're logged in, we can click Add a Peer. We can download Netbird, which will take us to the official website to start downloading the binary. Once that's done, we can click the installer in the top right, go through the standard process for installing this. Once that's done, we should be able to go to the settings on the Netbird icon and just copy this. So let's start the Netbird UI. Let's copy that down. We can see if we click in the system tray now, we can right click that. We can go to the settings, we can go to the advanced settings, and we want to change the management and the admin URL. So as it says, we need to change this management URL. So let's change that to what I've got here. So copy that, and then we'll just paste it in. So hopefully now we can just click save. And we should be able to click connect. So let's right click and then click connect. Now it's going to ask us to log in again, but because we've already logged in previously, that should just forward us on. So that login has been successful. So if we go back in here now to the peers, you'll see that that's now updated, and hopefully in a moment, yeah, you can see that I've got Windows 11 here, which is that machine I just set up. All three of those are now available. All three of those are now connected to our Netbird network. Now that we've got that set up, we can start to look at some of the more advanced features. So we can start putting these into different groups. So you might have different groups of people, different officers, and different territories. Those groupings will make things like the rules and the routes simpler to administrate. So if we have a look at the policies now, you can see that we've got the default one that's on, but we could obviously create a new one by hitting the plus in the top right hand corner. This would be, say, you could use a group or you could just use a peer, and then you could say where do you want to go to, and then you can obviously do things like you could enable one direction, so unidirectional, bidirectional. You can even select the type of protocol it's going to use. So choose whatever you want, and then you can choose to enable that or not, and you can also restrict some of those ports. So really awesome. This is basically a bit like a firewall. Also on this, you can set the DNS server. So it looks like we don't have any set up by default. That's fine. I don't think you can actually specify any in the configuration, but you can add a DNS name server here. So we'd use a custom one. And so for this, I would use something like either my firewall or whatever my DNS resolver is. You'd want to make sure, obviously, that the server has got access to this, and then you could apply it to whichever groups you want. You could even apply it to specific clients on the network. You might even want to do different name servers for different clients. Totally up to you. You've also then got your users for Netbird. So obviously a home user, it's probably just yourself as the administrator, but you'd obviously imagine at scale, you're probably going to want to have multiple people that can access and manage this. You'd probably want to create, as an identity provider, different user roles within Authentik and then pick those up automatically because it's using that federation model. That would pull those profiles into Netbird and you could manage them here. The service users is around API access. So if you want to have API access to this rather than going through the web UI, you could also set that up. You could probably do that so that you could automate deployment of Netbird via the API. After that, you've got some handy activity events so you can see when things occurred and who it was, which client, etc. And in the settings, you've also got things like how long you want the authentication to time out. So I've got this set for 24 hours. You'll actually notice that it's logging me in and out quite a few times. Not entirely sure what's going on there. I've probably got a setting set to restrictive. But either way, you've got the option to go and fix that. Plus, it was pretty seamless anyway. That refresh is pretty quick. You've got the user groups that you can assign, the different permissions for different users, and you've also got a danger zone where you can delete your account if you wanted to. So one of the coolest features of Netbird, much like Headscale, Tailscale, etc., is the routing, whereby any of these peers that we have on here, we can actually use as a network exit point, and we can also use those if they were in the field, for example. We could use these as basically a gateway to a different network. So what that means is I could use my mobile phone when I'm out and about. I could put that onto the cellular network, and my local devices could actually use that as an exit point. Similarly, if I had a device in a different country, I could use that as an exit node and basically create my own VPN. So if you've got geo restrictions, you could route your traffic out through there. Also, you could use this to connect to whatever LAN that's on. So you wouldn't need to go and install Netbird on all of the appliances in that LAN. You could use one specific device that it has Netbird installed and then use that to access the local LAN. So if it's on a different subnet or whatever, wherever it is, you could access those through that client running out in the field as though it's on your LAN. So we can either add a route or add an exit node. So let's do both. I'm going to add an exit node first. So at the moment, I've only got my Ubuntu virtual machine, and that's unfortunate because of this. The good news is it's coming in the next few weeks. However, that was May and it's now July. But fingers crossed that should come very soon. But anyway, let's demonstrate the process, not necessarily the exact result we want. So let me select the Netbird peer. I'm not going to select any groups, it's just the all one. So we could use an exit node only for specific nodes if we wanted to. And then let's click continue. It's going to ask for a name, so I'll do Ubuntu exit node. And then click continue. Do I want to enable it? Yes, I do. Let's add that exit node. So now that's an exit node. So hopefully if I go on to my virtual machine again, if I go down to the bottom here, hopefully I can right click that, click on network routes, and then you can see here now, sorry, it's small again, I've got the Ubuntu exit node selected. So now it's going to be using that for my exit node route. So that's pretty cool. And obviously the more you added into your exit nodes, the more options you would have available to you. So now back over on Netbird, let's click add route. So now we can create different network ranges. So this will be allow us to access the LANs and different VPCs by adding network routes. So for example, in here, we could add a private IPv range. It's going to be a bit difficult because most of this stuff is already set up on my LAN. And then we can enter the network range we want to be able to access here. We can then select the routing peer. So there's a handy diagram for this. If we click again, I must commend Netbird. Every time you've got an option, you can basically click that and you can go and see the documentation for that. But if you look at this diagram here, that's kind of what I was saying earlier. So imagine this is your private LAN and then you've got your mesh here. This here, this routing peer, say I put this machine, I don't know, let's say I put this over in America and I've got a different network up there, I've got a different office, whatever it is. You can set this one up as the routing peer and then allow it to access the LAN of that local office. So therefore, over here, if I was, say, in the UK, I could connect to this and then connect to all of my devices over in that different territory. Really awesome. So in here, again, I've only got the few examples. I've got my Ubuntu machine, but say this Ubuntu machine was elsewhere in the world, I could then use that to access it. I'll need to give this an IP address range, so let me just use the examples that's there for this one. And then click continue. Give it a network identifier. I'm just going to call this one Ubuntu again. It could be, I don't know, Ubuntu US, for example. Click continue. I'm going to enable it, and then you can actually masquerade it without configuring local routes. So I'm going to leave that on because typically you'd want to masquerade, and then I can click that add route. So now if this was in a real address. I haven't set it up to a real one for this demo, but I should be able to now access anything that's on that network that would be elsewhere in the world as though it was a local machine. And that's because the device I'm on has access to this mesh network, and this mesh network is allowing access to its local network, which is really awesome. And that's basically it. I think this is amazing user experience compared to the Headscale implementation. Don't get me wrong, the Headscale works, but the UI is flaky and it's not as robust as this. This just, once you've got that configuration file working, it just deploys and works. Now obviously, to get this working externally, you're going to need some port forwards. So the ports that I showed you at the beginning of the video, do make sure you've got some port forwards set up for that and it's pointing towards where your reverse proxy is. That will mean that then once you're out in the field, all of your devices will be able to connect remotely. I think technically if you connected internally and then left your network, that might still work because it's going to use a reverse tunnel, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, do let me know how you found that and if this is something that you're going to consider. I'm going to be switching over from Headscale to Netbird, and I'm going to give that a tour. I'm going to be using that in the next video, or maybe the next video, where we set up that VPC, our own private virtual cloud, using something like a NAS box that we're going to install Netbird onto. That will allow me to have remote connection and automatic failback connection to this machine without the need for port forwards on the other end, i.e. if I put this at my mother-in-law's house, I don't need to fanny about with her router. This will automatically connect back into my setup, so I don't have to worry about all of that stuff. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. There's a ton of documentation around this, so please do go and check it out. And there's a myriad of ways that you can set up Netbird. I've just shown you the way that fits my setup with that reverse proxy and Authentik, but you can choose basically whatever you want and follow the detailed instructions on their website. If you like this, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, let me know how you're going to use this. See you in the next one, everybody. Take care.